Dear friends, when a visitor received a cold reception from some of the Fat Controller's engines, it made the newcomer feel distressed and unwelcome. The engine in question was an LNER B12 called Beyer from the North Norfolk Railway, who suffered greatly at the hands of Gordon owing to some bad memories. This is because one former member of the North Western Railway fleet was of the same class and was badly behaved, as was another engine, an LNER B17. I speak, of course, of 98462 and 87546, the two rudest steam engines to grace, or should I say disgrace, Sudrian metals. But when it came to their fatal accident, the engines say they brought their fate upon themselves. See what you think. The author. The B-Class Bullies by A.H. Brazier. Based on the Railway series by the Reverend W. Audrey and Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends by Britt Allcroft and David Mitten. Vandalism. It's a ridiculous idea, grumbled Gordon one morning in the sheds. What on earth possessed the Fat Controller to bring over that engine, an engine that looks like him after all they did? Because it's to promote his railway. He is the only one of his kind in existence, Gordon, as you, being an experimental prototype yourself, should know, replied Edward crossly. He had noticed how sad the visitor who was standing in a siding had looked, and felt sorry for him. Anyway, he is a visitor, and should be respected, so curb your tongue unless you have anything nice to say. Recently, the Fat Controller had made arrangements with the North Norfolk Railway for their LNER B12 locomotive to work on Sodor that autumn. The B12, who was numbered 8572, was due for repairs, and the railway was to host some fundraising events to earn money. There were special events across both Sodor and Norfolk. Both the North Western Railway and the North Norfolk Railway had arranged for fun runs. Thomas had been loaned to the North Norfolk Railway for several Day Out with Thomas events, and 8572 was even pulling expresses up to Barrow in Furness, with all the profits going to his repairs. This was particularly useful since Pip and Emma, the high-speed twins who usually took the express there, were away being overhauled too, following a breakdown affecting both of them. Predictably, Gordon wasn't too keen on these arrangements, especially since he secretly wanted to pull the express to Barrow himself again. Unfortunately, the engine's design was exactly the same as one of two engines who had already arrived on Sodor. This caused some tension amongst Gordon, Henry, and Thomas. Fortunately, Thomas had spoken to 8572 before he left and found him to be a friendly sort of an engine, and the two had become friends. Meanwhile, Henry, although he would often look at 8572 with distrust, always spoke to him with politeness. Gordon, on the other hand, constantly shouted insults at him whenever they passed each other, and was doing so now as he puffed away to take his express. "Unwanted pile of scrap!" he shouted. Poor 8572 looked as though he would cry very soon. He had had enough of Gordon's insults, and this was the worst one he had heard. Edward gently pulled up, a kind smile on his face. "Hello," said Edward. "I'm Edward. What's your name?" "I don't have a name officially. Most of the enthusiasts call me by my number, 8572, but the other engines call me Beyer, after one of my designers. So I suppose you can call me that," Beyer said quietly. "Quite right. Having a name makes you feel like you really belong somewhere. I take it you're rather afraid of that big engine." Edward asked. Beyer gently murmured, "Uh-huh." "Don't worry about Gordon. It's times like this when he gets ideas above his station that he gets overconfident. Like that time when he got stuck on the hill after saying how little I was and how grand he would look pulling the big express." The two engines started talking about their past. Beyer learned about some of the adventures Edward had had, such as the time he had rescued Trevor the traction engine from scrap, and when he had managed to get a group of enthusiasts home during a particularly bad storm. Edward learned about Beyer's past as well, from when he was first built to when he had been repainted into his British Railways livery, to the day he was rescued by preservationists. By the time they had finished, you would have thought they were old friends. "I swear, Edward, I thought I'd never get out of that horrible place," exclaimed Beyer. "Well, you deserved it, unlike the last engine I met who looked like you." Edward smiled before realizing what he had just said. He suddenly went very quiet. "What makes you say that?" asked Beyer. "Well, let's just say it was a case of a bad experience," replied Edward. "We once had another LNER B12 98462 he was called. He and an experimental LNER B17 H7546 we called him. Well, to be honest, they were two of the most horrible engines you could ever meet. They were both sent away years ago, though. I'd say about 1922, so thankfully we never saw them again. Although, even they may not have entirely deserved their fate. I've got time before my next train is due to leave if you would like to hear this story, but I do warn you, you may find it disturbing. I suppose I would like to hear it, if only to understand why Gordon is so mean to me. At least your number 3 is polite, and your LBNSCRE2 friend Thomas is a pleasant sort of engine." Edward smiled, and this is the story he told. Many years ago, 3 small railways, the Sodor Mainland Railway, the Tidmouth, Knapford and Aylesbridge Railway, and the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway merged into one railway, the North Western Railway. It was run by the Fat Controller's grandfather, Sir Charles Topham Hatt, otherwise known as the Fat Director. This change came with some considerable expansion of the line, and to help build and run it, new engines were brought in, such as Thomas, Edward, Henry and Gordon. Thomas and Edward were 2 of the first engines to arrive and helped with the construction work. After this was finished, Thomas became a station pilot, shunting trucks and coaches for the other engines, until he would rescue James and earn his own branch line. Edward was used less and less, until the day he got taken out for a passenger run, and did so well that his driver promised to take him out again the next day. The line had 3 other engines. One of them was called Eagle. He was red, the same colour that James would eventually become. He was a helpful sort of engine and was willing to come to the aid of those in need. The other 2 were blue engines. They had no names, only numbers. 98462 and 87546. These 2 engines were callous, rude, and disrespectful towards the other engines. They prided themselves greatly, considering themselves above everyone else, and were not afraid of saying so, to the point where even Gordon, for all his arrogance, grew hurt and impatient with them. One day, Thomas was shunting coaches for Eagle's stopping service into the platform at the big station at Vickerstown. He stopped and his driver uncoupled him, ready for him to shunt the express into the station for 98462. Gordon was away for some minor repairs, following an accident with a car at a level crossing. The damage to him wasn't too bad, but one of his buffers had been dented. Anyway, 98462 reversed crossly into the station, disobeying a signal set at danger, which was set to warn engines that Thomas was on the line. "Hurry up, little puffball," he snapped at Thomas. "You're blocking my line." Thomas seethed crossly. "It's you who's on the wrong part of the line, you bully. You just passed the signal at danger. You might have derailed yourself on the points," he snapped crossly. "Ha! As if I'd derail myself on points, I'm so big, laughed 98462 rudely. You're smaller than a spider compared to me, little Thomas, and dare I say about as good looking as a pig. So I think I can have better luck on a pair of stupid points. Thankfully, 98462 had not found the points, so Thomas was still able to move over to the other line. It was most unfortunate, however, that neither engine had noticed a group of young men throwing rocks at one of the points Thomas was due to cross over, jamming them, and that the signalman had almost forgotten about Thomas until he saw the two engines on the same tracks. As soon as he set the points straight in front of Thomas, Thomas started to move. He then quickly moved over to change the other points, so Thomas could move onto the other line, run around the coaches and get behind them to push 98462's train to help it start. As soon as he realised those points were jammed, he rushed out and tried to warn Thomas, but his cries were unheeded. Thomas was in such a foul mood that he didn't notice, and anyway, he was moving much too fast to stop in time. As soon as he crossed over the points, the front two wheels on his left climbed up and over the rails and crunched the ballast, while the other front two wheels on his left rested on the sleepers. "Bust my bumpers!" he exclaimed. 98462 laughed rudely. "See what I mean?" he chuckled. "I would never have any trouble with points, I'm so big." "Well, your driving wheels might not, but your wheels in front might," snapped an embarrassed Thomas in anger. Soon, Eagle brought the breakdown train with the fact director on board. First, he helped 98462's train to start, then he returned to help clear the mess and take Thomas to the works. The fact director spoke kindly to Thomas. "The accident wasn't your fault, Thomas. Those hooligans should have known better than to throw rocks onto the line. However, I'm afraid you'll have to go to the works for a few repairs. Eagle will take over your work, and Edward will, I'm sure, be willing to help with Eagle's trains." "Thank you, sir," Thomas said sadly. Thomas was loaded onto a flatbed, and Eagle took him to the works. "Cheer up, Thomas," encouraged Eagle. "The accident could have been worse, after all." Thomas sighed. "It's not that, Eagle. It's 98462. He called me a little puffball and said he could never derail himself on points." "Pah!" retorted Eagle. "Take no notice of him. You know what he and 87546 are like. Besides, with an attitude like that, his words would probably come back and bite him in the coal bunker one day." Eagle was righter than he thought. Over the next few days, while Thomas was being mended, Eagle would shunt the express for 98462, noticing and even trying to tell him that he was moving into the station with the signal and points set against him. But 98462 just laughed rudely. However, this would soon come to an end. On the day Thomas was due to return, 98462 was pulling an express train from Barrow-in-Furness to the big station. "Come on, come on, come on," he demanded to the coaches. All right, we're coming, grumbled the coaches. "Ha! Look at me now, sang 98462. "Poop, poop, 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 poop. I'd like to see some stupid points stop me now." But he'd reckoned without Jack. Jack was a new signalman, and today was his first day on the job. He hadn't met all the engines before. The engine he heard in the distance was, he thought, 87546 on a stopping train. So he tried to set the points in the station ready for the train to run round, successfully changing one of them so that 98462 would be diverted towards the second platform. But 98462 had been moving much too fast. He crossed over one set of points, derailed on the other, continued to move at a dangerous speed and climbed up and over onto the platform. The guard had saved the coaches. He had happened to lean out of his window before 98462 crossed the points, and saw that the points ahead of them were against the train. Knowing what would happen, he slammed on his brakes, significantly slowing down so that 98462 would come off the rails. 98462 looked ridiculous. The whole of his body was mounted on the platform, and half of his tender hung dangerously over the edge, while the other half was nestled in the track. Angry staff and passengers helped each other off the ground and out of the coaches, and swarmed around 98462, embarrassing him and saying what a bad railway it was. Worst of all, he saw Thomas, who had just returned that morning and had seen everything. Thomas was laughing so hard it looked as though his boiler would burst. The fat director came out of his office to see what had happened. One look at the awkward disaster told him everything. He glowered meaningfully at Thomas, who stopped laughing and started to pull the coaches away. Then he spoke severely to Jack and 98462. Jack immediately apologized and promised to help clear up the mess. 98462, on the other hand, insisted it was not his fault. I'm aware of that, 98462, but Thomas has told me about what you said to him. You deserve this accident from all the trouble you cause us. Maybe next time you'll be more careful on what you say about points and passing signals at danger too. And you can forget ever pulling the express again, I can assure you that much. He turned on his heels and walked sternly away, leaving 98462 to gnash his teeth in rage. And lo, he was right. 98462 never pulled another express for the rest of his life, finished Edward. That's not right, exclaimed Beyer. I thought you were going to tell me about how he and 87546 got sent away. Ah, but that story was just an example of their bad behaviour, replied Edward. Anyway, I will tell you more later, but I've got a train to take now, and so have you by the looks of your points. Beyer looked down and gasped. My express! He cried and hurried away. Edward laughed. It's quite an amusing engine, and interesting too, he chuckled, and puffed away to pick up his trucks to take to the China Clay Works. You have been listening to the B-Class Bullies Story 1, Vandalism, written and read by TARDIS9. The music was provided by Mike O'Donnell, Julia Campbell, S.A. Music, Kevin MacLeod, and Scarloey Reneus. The producer was TARDIS9. Thomas & Friends is copyright of Mattel Incorporated.